Have you ever thought about how many people on the territory of Ukraine do not believe in this war and do not want to be in the Russian army? In fact, when we consider the war policies implemented by Russian leader Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, it's not difficult to estimate that the number of people who do not want to take part in this war has reached very serious levels. The most important factor in the failure of anti-war Russian soldiers and Russian citizens forcibly sent to the Ukrainian front lines to obey Putin's orders is Russia's inability to provide humanitarian conditions for its soldiers and citizens who join the volunteer army. For this reason, the Russians on the Ukrainian front lines do not want to face the restrictive problems such as infectious diseases, hunger and thirst in Ukraine. The Ukrainian forces, on the other hand, have a very striking project that will go down in world history. The name of this project is I Want to Live. This incredible project, which offers a new hope of life for Russians, has become very popular among Russian soldiers and citizens, especially in recent days. Ukrainian officials reported that a website called I Want to Live, created for Russian soldiers who wanted to surrender, had attracted a total of more than 15 million visitors in the last 7 months. The I Want to Live hotline receives an average of 80 calls a day from people who don't want to die for the Russian regime in Russia or the occupied territory of Ukraine and want to surrender. In addition, according to the latest reports of Ukrainian officials involved in this surrender line project, approximately 3,200 Russian soldiers have surrendered to the Ukrainian armed forces since last month. Vitaly Matvienko, head of the Ukraine hotline, announced recently that more than 16,000 Russian applicants have surrendered to the Ukrainian armed forces through the project since the start of September. On the other hand, the Ukrainian official added that the number of Russian applications increased by 10% from March to April. These numbers are described as high enough to thwart leader Vladimir Putin's plans to invade Ukraine. Also, in a tweet recently, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry used the surrender project as a mockery against the Kremlin. In this tweet, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry emphasized that the closer the counterattack, the hotter the surrender season. The continuation of the tweet was as follows: "Don't wait for the heat. There are currently the most favorable conditions for surrender." These striking statements had the effect of an earthquake in Moscow. In addition, such approach just destroyed the trust of Russian citizens in the Moscow administration. Therefore, the number of Russian citizens who wanted to surrender was normally increasing day by day. Vitaly Matvienko, spokesperson for the I Want to Live hotline, stated that in the last 6 months they received a total of 12,000 questions from the Russians about surrender. In addition, Matvienko added that the calls to ask questions about surrender came mainly from Moscow and Leningrad regions, as well as Chelyabinsk, Novgorod and occupied Donetsk, Luhansk and Crimea. Matvienko noted that the I Want to Live team sometimes found themselves on the phone saying words of consolation to Russians who burst into tears. In fact, we know very well that after 20 years of propaganda in Russia, the people there have been completely brainwashed. But there is still a group of intelligent people who can think critically. Russian citizens fleeing from Russia's occupation policies by calling the surrender line called I Want to Live are the most concrete examples of this situation. Meanwhile, Ukraine developed new strategies and demonstrated remarkable ingenuity to persuade Russian soldiers to surrender. Konstantin Melnikov, a war correspondent who is often on the front lines, explained that the Ukrainian military designs its own unique advertising campaigns. In this campaign, Melnikov noted Ukrainian troops printed special leaflets, loading them into shells and fired them into the Russian-occupied territory with a Grad rocket launcher. The leaflets state in Russian that the Russians should surrender voluntarily, and they give accurate statistics of the Ukrainian General Staff on Russian casualties. In addition, the brochures prepared within the scope of the campaign include the phone numbers that those who want to surrender can call. The most striking detail in the brochures was a price list showing how much money Russian soldiers can earn if they surrendered with their equipment. According to the price list prepared by the Ukrainians, Russian soldiers who deliver a tank can receive a total payment of $10,000. Also, alongside these campaigns in the expansion of the I Want to Live project, in December, a training video was released explaining to prospective Russian POWs how to surrender not only directly to the Ukrainian authorities, but also to a drone. Analysts predict that more and more Russians will surrender, noting that Ukraine, unlike Russia, complies with the Geneva Conventions as well as such campaigns and practices when it comes to respecting the rights of prisoners of war. Ukrainian Ombudsman Dmytro Leibniz confirmed that a monitoring mission carried out on March 28 is one of the camps where Russian prisoners are held has met international standards for the treatment of prisoners. Leibniz and his team carried out this critical task. Leibniz found on his Telegram channel that Russian prisoners of war are being held in accordance with the requirements of the Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War. According to the observations of Leibniz and his team, the temperature conditions and daily routine at the facilities met all the requirements of the contract. In addition, surrendering Russian soldiers have the right to communicate and work with their relatives in turn through periodic telephone calls. According to the requirements of the Geneva Convention, the surrendered here are fed a military menu. In addition, human rights and social activist Tatiana Ivanova emphasized that when the Russians were taken prisoner in the caravanserai, they saw that the conditions of captivity were not humiliating. Considering all of this, Ukraine was proving to the whole world how conscientious and humane it approached the prisoners of war. The surrendered Russians are, of course, in detention. Of course they are in detention centers. But according to the agreement implemented by the Ukrainians, these people are kept separate from the criminals. They were not kept in the same cells as the criminals. These people say that they are ready to work on the construction sites here and repair what they have destroyed. In short, Russian soldiers and citizens who surrendered to the Ukrainian armed forces never want to return to Russia. They don't want to go back because they know what awaits them at home. So how did I Want to Live, presented by Ukraine, which is a completely new hope of life for Russians, begin? The project was created to provide Russian and Belarusian military personnel to escape the war in Ukraine. I Want to Live spokesman Vitaly Matvienko stated that they officially launched the surrender line on September 18, 2022, a few days before Russian President Vladimir Putin announced the start of the mobilization. The hotline, which was initially supervised by the National Police of Ukraine, was later transferred to Kazabov. The surrender line I Want to Live, which has become almost corporate, is now operated around the clock by operators who answer calls and process messages from various messaging applications. Matvienko noted that in addition to investigations from active soldiers, the initiative has received numerous calls from Russian civilians who fear that they will be enlisted soon. The increase in surrender numbers was mainly due to fears of a counterattack expected this spring from Ukraine. In fact, the vast majority of Russians do not want to fight. They want to save their own lives by surrendering. This is a good alternative because the days ahead are not looking good for Russia. The approach of the Moscow administration towards its capitulating citizens is much more hopeless than the possible future situation of Russia. In a preemptive move to intimidate asylum seekers, Russia's Supreme Court ruled last week that Russian soldiers could be sentenced to up to 10 years in prison for voluntarily surrendering. Here is a short and clear summary of the value Russia attaches to its citizens and soldiers. This is the most visible proof that free will no longer exist in Russia. But freedom is such an important phenomenon that the Russians, who want to live free despite the threats of the Putin regime and surrender to Kiev, respect the freedom of the Ukrainians in the same way. There is a lot of news from Bakhmut. Here the Russians are desperately trying to put the Ukrainians in a pocket, But because their progress has been so slow, the Ukrainians started using this time to adjust their defense, and the Russians conducted an aggressive assault in an attempt to encircle at least some troops. However, they underestimated the level of protection of Ukrainian flanks and were destroyed in the northern part of Bakhmut. There are a lot of important changes. Last time I told you that the Russians started assaulting Brestkovska from the north and that any progress here would force the Ukrainians to step back from Krasnohora to avoid operational encirclement. I also told you that there are a lot of natural and artificial barriers in this region, such as a river and a railway embankment that limit the room for maneuver significantly. That is why over the last 4 days, all Russian attacks here have been rebuffed and the Russians were forced to shift their focus somewhere else. Their new target became the northern part of Bakhmut, which is in front of Yadin. At first, attacking it was extremely dangerous because the Ukrainians were controlling the outer streets south of Horodnya. But as the Ukrainians inside Bakhmut started slowly withdrawing from the eastern bank and moving to the central part of the town, the Russians were able to assume their positions here and secured their flanks for an attack towards Yadin. After re-evaluation of the situation, the Russians assaulted this area and started pushing towards the railway station. The Ukrainians here established their main defense line behind the railways because here they are basically attached to the biggest industrial area in Bakhmut, meaning that supplying this group and maintaining positions is not difficult so far. Heavy fights are taking place in the outer streets. When it comes to Bakhmut itself, a lot of sources confirm that the Ukrainians are withdrawing troops from the eastern part of Bakhmut in order to not allow the Russians to carry out a tactical encirclement of the Bakhmut group. As predicted, most Ukrainian troops are withdrawing near the first bridge, while some troops are holding key defense points such as the meat processing plant, the high-rise buildings, and the river. According to the latest reports, the Ukrainians have withdrawn from the northern part almost completely. They have withdrawn from the park and half of the residential area. The Russians saw that their window of opportunity was closing and decided to attack the withdrawing Ukrainians from the southeast. If successful, they would be able to completely encircle Ukrainian troops in the high-rise buildings. They launched their assault across the small river, and even though they successfully crossed it, they failed to develop their attack and were stopped at the cemetery. When it comes to the southern part of Bakhmut here, the Russians have 2 axes of advance towards the southeastern suburbs and towards the forest near Ivanovskaya. The main goal here is to establish direct fire control over the Ukrainian supply route. Ideally for the Russians, they needed to enter the southeastern suburbs because it would give them greater visual control over the road. However, the Ukrainians understand this, and so far all Russian attacks have been rebuffed. Nonetheless, the Russians did advance inside the forest, and according to the unconfirmed reports, the fights are already taking place somewhere close to Ivanovsky. The main weakness of the Russians here is that they are advancing along a very narrow passage, which makes them extremely vulnerable to flank attacks. Since the Ukrainians are controlling the whole area on the other side of the canal, the Ukrainians can conduct a counterattack from the south and completely encircle the Russian group. And as you remember, the weather in February is freezing, so this little 10-meter wide canal will be covered with ice, making it easy to cross at any point. And interestingly, Russian sources reported today that the Ukrainians are preparing to conduct a series of counterattacks in different areas around Bakhmut, and the forest near Ivanovsky is likely one of their targets. Overall, the Ukrainians are tightly holding the northern and southern parts of Bakhmut and not allowing the Russians to encircle it from 2 sides simultaneously. The Ukrainians are slowly withdrawing from the eastern bank of the river and have already completed the process by around 50%. A complete withdrawal from the eastern bank will mark the beginning of the second stage of the battle for Bakhmut, and we will likely see another spike in Russian losses as they will have to storm fresher and more formidable fortifications. And as the Ukrainians will conduct a series of counterattacks, this will prolong the battle for Bakhmut, drain Russian reserves, and complicate the development of the upcoming Russian offensive operation in the Luhansk region. Tensions in the Mediterranean, Black Sea, Arctic and Atlantic seas continue to escalate in the shadow of the war in Ukraine. EU commanders and military observers are sounding the alarm about the activities of Russia's submarine fleet thousands of miles off the US coast. At the same time, US coastal security has been sounding the alarm about Russian warships and spy ships recently appearing off the coasts of Washington and Hawaii. There is no border violation in the Atlantic or any dangerous attempt to create an environment of mutual conflict. However, considering the current situation, the activities of the Russian Navy at a distance of less than 1,000 miles from the US coast are enough to put the US Navy on the alert for coastal security. Let's take a look at the US Navy's approach to Russian Navy submarines and warships and the activities of the Russian Navy at close ranges to the US coast. As Divine Justice, we strive to bring you the most striking news as quickly as possible. By working hard day and night collectively with our expert staff, you can support us by subscribing to our channel. Throughout the war, which began when Putin launched a full-scale invasion of neighboring Ukraine last February, Russian Navy forces have accumulated in the Black Sea. The presence of Russian submarines on the US coast and in the Mediterranean is also increasing, according to officials. The Russian Navy commands one of the most diverse submarine fleets in the world. Some can carry ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads, which Moscow sees as the key to its strategic deterrence. For this reason, this increase observed in the USA and the Mediterranean coasts is of serious importance. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia has been working to develop its submarine fleet, especially in the last few years. Moscow has produced a fleet of submarines capable of hitting the most critical targets in the US and continental Europe. In this regard, Putin stated that his country will build more nuclear-powered submarines that will ensure Russia's security for decades to come. There are indications that nuclear-powered submarines are being deployed off the coast of the United States and elsewhere in the Mediterranean and around Europe. According to Michael Peterson, director of the Russian Institute for Maritime Studies, which studies the Russian military, these Russian deployments that Peterson mentioned are reminiscent of the Soviet-style submarines in the Cold War. On the other hand, the U.S. Northern Command and head of NORAD's U.S. Air Force General Glenn Van Herk warned of the increasing presence of nuclear-powered Severodvinsk-class submarines on U.S. coasts. Van Herk described Russia as the primary threat to the country at the moment. According to Van Herk, the Russians first moved the Severodvinsk submarines to the Pacific. Another sub is currently in the Mediterranean and another one is heading towards the Atlantic. This could be a persistent, imminent threat that could carry significant numbers of ground attack cruise missiles that could threaten the US in 2021. Van Herk described Russian submarines as equivalent to domestic submarines in terms of silence. For this reason, the head of NORAD argues that the situation should be prevented as soon as possible so that the Russians do not operate quietly in the seas. US Navy Vice Admiral Andrew Woody Lewis told the U.S. Naval Institute and Center for Strategic and International Studies think tank that the growing presence of Russian submarine activity in the Atlantic Ocean means that his service no longer considers the East Coast. We've seen a growing number of Russian submarines deployed in the Atlantic, and they are more capable, deployed longer, and equipped with more deadly weapon systems than ever before. The U.S. Navy is also strong enough not to be underestimated. In addition, the U.S. Navy is currently undergoing a modernization move. The U.S. fleet has a total of 64 submarines, including 50 nuclear-powered attack submarines. Their job is to support ground operations and carrier groups and conduct surveillance, according to the nonprofit Nuclear Threat Initiative. In addition, the United States began construction in June 2022. The new SSBN, the largest and most advanced Columbia-class nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine. 3 of the country's most powerful attack submarines were reportedly deployed by the U.S. Navy in July 2021. The U.S. Navy has deployed the most secret U.S. submarine, the Ohio-class SSBN in the Arabian Sea. Russia, on the other hand, did not hesitate to make a move against all this. The Admiral Gorshkov frigate, armed with Zircon hypersonic missiles, advanced towards Washington. The Russian frigate, Admiral Gorshkov, essentially the first warship converted to use Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles, has been spotted moving towards the east coast of the United States. Judging by the data from open sources, it's now claimed that the Russian warship has already crossed half the Atlantic Ocean, and this has seriously worried Washington since the launch range of Zircon missiles can reach 2,000 kilometers. The Admiral Gorshkov guided missile frigate was under close surveillance by NATO naval forces during its maiden voyage. This surveillance actually occurred after the Royal Navy intercepted Gorshkov and his Navy force earlier this month as they crossed the English Channel. More recently, the Russian ship was being tracked in the Atlantic by the Portuguese Navy and was expected to surround Africa. But radar surveillance sites suggest Admiral Gorshkov made an unexpected maneuver. A compelling report on the subject suggests that the Russian frigate has left the escort tanker in the Bay of Biscay and headed west. There has been no official statement from the Russian Ministry of Defense on this matter, but if the information provided by British journalists is correct, in the coming days, the Russian frigate may approach Washington within striking distance of hypersonic weapons. The U.S. Coast Guard reported that it was tracking a suspected Russian spy ship in international waters off the coast of Hawaii as tensions between Washington and Moscow continue due to Russia's war in Ukraine. The Coast Guard noted that the situation is not unusual, but is being closely monitored. In the statement shared by the U.S. Coast Guard, it was frequently observed that while foreign military vessels could freely pass through the exclusive economic zone of the USA, foreign-flagged military vessels were operating and navigating within the intervention area of the Coast Guard Zone 14, according to international customary laws. This was not the first time suspected Russian spy ships have been spotted off the coast of the United States. In 2019, a Russian spy ship was spotted off the southeast coast of the U.S. by 2 U.S. officials, and this Russian ship was observed operating on an unsafe route. The actions of this Russian surveillance and spy ship, Viktor Lenov, sailing off the coast of South Carolina and Florida, were determined to be unsafe as it did not use flashing lights in low visibility weather and did not respond to attempts by merchant ships to communicate to avoid it. Following the detection of this Russian ship, the USCG said in a statement that it continues to coordinate with DoD partners, provide updates on foreign ship movements and activities, and meet availability appropriately to promote international maritime norms. After the USCG statements, the danger of Russian spy ships in the seas continued, but the USA did not turn a blind eye to the Russians on this issue. The U.S. Coast Guard tracked another Russian intelligence ship sailing near the Hawaiian coast again, according to the video released by the U.S. Coast Guard. The ship was determined to be the Vishnya-class intelligence ship Karelia. Satellite photos showed the Russian ship approaching 40 kilometers, or about 25 miles from the Hawaiian coast. Pentagon Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh announced at a press conference that the Coast Guard continues to monitor the ship. The Pentagon did not know why the Russians were taking the ship near Hawaii, but Singh said it was completely precarious timing attached to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security to investigate this matter. The unit is working with the Department of Defense to monitor ship movements and, if necessary, provide additional U.S. presence in an area where a foreign military vessel may be navigating. On the other hand, Russian intelligence ships had sailed near Hawaii before, while the Coast Guard followed Karelia in May 2021. At that time, the ship was sailing in international waters and was not dangerous for navigation. However, with the increase in tension and danger in the seas in recent days, the situations have started to change considerably. Only the USA and its allies are expected to make a daunting move against Russia's steps that may pose an element of danger. Experts on this issue stated that the USA and its allies should do more activities in the high north to deter China and Russia. An agreement between senior naval officers from the three countries and a National Security Council official. He acknowledged that the physical presence of allied navies and coast guards is becoming increasingly important as Russia strengthens its military presence and China expands its intentions beyond trade in high northern waters. These measures should be taken as soon as possible for safer maritime borders, and the expansionist policies of the Russians should be prevented in the seas.